Hello, everyone, and today I have the pleasure of welcoming Lucy Hunter. Now, Lucy is an award-winning garden designer and more recently floral stylist, photographer, and author. We're going to talk about all that. And Lucy is constantly looking at ways to soften the boundaries between the outside and in. She lives on the side of a mountain in North Wales, United Kingdom, with her husband and a menagerie of animals. I love that introduction. And you and I just got back from one of Sharon Santoni's tours, and you to Provence, where you and obviously Sandra Sigmund from Le Fleur were leading this whole garden discussion, garden viewing, garden analysis, but also doing arrangements, which was, a show unto itself. It was just incredible. And in that you kind of introduced yourself as like different from Sandra because you said I photograph flowers. It's more of a visual art form rather than, say, a floral shop where you're doing designs that you'll sell or bring to your home or whatever. Talk about that a little bit. Talk about the way you walk into flowers.
Maybe then I need to sort of go back a little bit and sort of how I've got to flowers, because actually I wouldn't call myself a florist, which Sandra very much is.
Right.
And sometimes I struggle I don't know what to call myself at all. So I think the thing, when people say, what is it you do? I always say, well, I've been a landscape designer for 20 years because that is what I do and what I still do now. But I guess that sort of forms the way that I look at flowers, in that I've always looked at them outside in the, a larger context, always creating gardens for my clients. And it was, I started really, going back further than that. So I did a fine art degree originally at university. And I did that degree for, 3 years, a long, long time ago now. Mm-hmm. And at the end of it, my parents basically said, well, look, you've had a lovely time wafting around for 3 years, but really you ought to go and get a proper job now. And which was fine, this was the sort of the 90s, and proper jobs were not creative. Creativity wasn't really seen as a thing. I think it's changing a bit now, but I'm sure we'll talk about that later. But it was more, a proper job was sort of, sitting behind a desk.
Yes.
Answering email lists, or actually emails weren't even really a thing back in the early 90s, were they? Just
shocking how time flies.
I know.
Technology changes our lives. Yes.
So I did as I was told, and I went to work in a bank for 8 years. I know, which was about as far removed from my life at that point as you could possibly get. But I like to do what I'm told. I'm quite sort of compliant like that. So I thought that was the thing I should do. So I became an underwriter, underwriting consumer loans with a headset on, sat all day trying to hit targets. And it was just before all the big banks crashed. It was before that. So the money was just being given to anybody, and which was a bit of a thing in itself. Mm-hmm. I just knew that I was desperately unhappy, and I wasn't very good at it. I just wanted to be outside. I've always wanted to be outside. So I sort of was quite unhappy for about 7 years. I carried on. Because I think you get stuck as well, don't you? You sort of start to earn a certain amount of money, and then it's very difficult to, if you haven't got a strong sort of, it's quite scary to leave an income source. And I hadn't gone home, still have a fabulous relationship with my parents, but I'd chosen to stay in the north of the country. Mm-hmm. So I had to, really did have to support myself. Mm-hmm. So I stayed for a long time, and then eventually I got married and had my son, who's now 21. And my husband was really supportive. He worked away a lot, but I needed a job where I needed to work. I needed to bring in money, but I wanted a job where I could be at home with Matthew. And and just be outside. I just
Yeah.
don't want to be in that bank at all. So eventually we moved from a tiny, tiny little flat in a city centre out to the country. And it sort of inherited this tiny, tiny garden. And I became totally obsessed. And
Obsession.
complete obsession, and spent all my time sort of reading up about flowers and going to flower shows and, everything I could possibly. And eventually I went back to college. A dear friend of mine had Matthew, and he was only 18 months at the time. And she had him for a couple of days a week. I paid her, she had him with her children who were the same age. So that was nice. And I went back to college and trained as a garden designer.
Oh, so the MFA, the original degree, what was that about?
That was fine art. So that effectively was wafting around with a paintbrush, painting for 3 years. Yeah. Okay. Trying to be an artist, looking angst, probably drinking too much beer. As you do. But I was 18, and I think it's something I've given a lot of thought to now, being 50, and my teenager now being 21, and that whole kind of coming out of the school system, especially here in the UK, you tend to finish your A-levels at 18, and then it's the next step tends to be invariably going to university, and not everybody's cut out to go to university. But it seems to be, again, I think it's changing for the better. But I think it was either you leave you don't go, you leave school and you go and get a job. It was a kind of, if you were, what's the right word to say, really? It was expected you would go to university.
Yeah. Well, and also it was kind of a banner of success. You absolutely had to go that path if you were a successful young person.
Exactly. And I'm not sure that at 18, I knew I was creative. I knew that I'd done okay in my exams, but I knew I was never going to make Oxford, Cambridge material. And I didn't want to be a doctor or a lawyer or anything like that at all. So, but as I said, creativity wasn't a great, wasn't a thing that you could possibly earn money from.
No,
it wasn't a thing, unless you became an artist, and I didn't have the confidence, for one thing, to actually pursue that. Okay. So that's why I just found this really random job in banking. I don't even know how I got it, to be honest.
Those were the days. Yeah, those were the days. But fast forward again to the small house in the country with the garden in the backyard. Is that when flowers, or the idea of flowers, the idea of gardens, really came into your life? Because that was a big change to go even from, a fine arts degree into banking, and now you're going to school to be a garden designer, landscape designer.
Yeah. And I think, so at that point, I think I thought and it did seem to be a really sort of random thing for me suddenly to become completely passionate in. When I think back now, my paternal grandmother had always gardened. And we had spent quite a lot of time with her as young children, with her, staying with her, and we'd just always been in the garden with her. And I think that she's had an enormous effect on me. And she was a florist in those kind of sort of 50s. She wasn't a florist. She wasn't earning money from selling flowers, but she certainly brought flowers in, was always pressing them, was always arranging them, always wanted to. So that creativity. So, but I think I kind of pushed that to the back of my mind. I'd kind of sort of disregarded that. That was something you might do at the weekends, kind of thing, So, so now, yes, I think maybe that had always been part of me.
Yeah,
it's not something that I sort of rediscovered until we moved into this house, and I would have been late 20s, early 30s by then.
Okay.
So I became this garden designer, and I thought, well, I just needed to, we worked out the finances, and I just needed to I needed to do one small job. I had no huge plans, no great, sort of business plan at all. I needed to do one small job a month, which would which would be the same amount of money that I was earning from the bank.
Okay.
So about the bank. Anyway, so I did little hand drawing leaflets with a little symbol, a little topiary tree, and I posted them through. We lived in a tiny village, and I posted them through all the letterboxes. And one person came back and went, "Yeah, I've got." And she had no budget. I mean, it was tiny job, but she knew lots of people. She knew lots of people.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So, and it was literally like that. The jobs just got bigger and bigger, and I became more passionate, and I did a couple of RHS show gardens. I got a gold medal for one of them, which was a pretty big deal, really. That was 2006, and that then changed my clients because I had more credibility in what I was doing.
Yeah.
So my clients got bigger, and it's all about who you meet, isn't it?
Sure. But Lucy, how did you even have the courage to enter into a competition like that? I'm assuming you had to enter. Yeah. Say it again. What did you say?
Stupidity.
Oh, no.
I don't know. I thought, well, why not? And that's, when I think about it, actually, that's a really good question, because I don't come from a hugely confident family, really. We've always been quite sort of shy and introverted, really, and sort of, just doing our own thing quietly. So I don't know, but there was something inside me. There was a voice inside me saying, go on, have a go. What's the worst that can happen?
Yeah.
So I did.
Yeah.
And it was great. It was the best thing that could happen.
Wow.
So it was obviously just meant to be, wasn't it? I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But so those, and then eventually, sorry, this is probably a really long drawn out story.
No, it's related. Yeah. Yeah.
Eventually, those clients got bigger, as I said, and I ended up with a really wealthy client with really quite a big budget. And I'd worked for him before, so we had sort of established this working relationship, and he trusted me, and which is a lot to do with, when you're spending money, you need to have this kind of relationship with clients and everything. So we had that, and he moved to a new home not far from Manchester Airport, so in the northwest of the UK. He wasn't a footballer. Just I said, where do you live? I say Manchester. Everybody goes, oh, Manchester United, but not and so though I have worked for footballers, but not him. Anyway, so he bought, as I say, wealthy man. He moved into this house, and he bought 27 acres of potato fields, as you do.
God.
Next to him, that were the neighbouring farm. And he just said, right, Lucy, create me a park. No budget.
Oh, my God.
How incredible is that? What a brief is that? I mean, there aren't that many briefs. So like that at all. So I spent the next 4 years literally creating him a park, and we brought in, and this is the wonderful thing about Europe, is that we can bring in instant mature trees pretty easily from where they're grown over in Germany. Which is a fascinating thing. So we brought in, millions of pounds worth of trees. Yeah. He wanted an instant garden. We built formal pools. We built 2-acre lakes. We built formal wood gardens and woodland gardens, and it was incredible. It was, and I learned more on that job than you could learn in 100 years at college. You know what I mean? It was incredible. But the thing was that I hadn't really taken on board, because I was sort of thinking, this is it. I've made it. I am the success. It's fabulous. But actually, that took its toll. It really took its toll, because I stopped looking. I stopped being creative. I stopped. It like anything big like this, it became about looking at spreadsheets, back returns, suppliers, lighting designs, managing 30 male landscapers on site, as the only female on site. And yes, fantastic skills that I developed, but it really burnt me out.
Yeah.
And I sort of neglected everything else. I was sort of in this bubble for 4 years because it was so huge, like any job, that.
Right. Like, But it's interesting, because you talked about how in banking, And I hear a lot of women talk about this, how you get caught up in the amount they pay you, the benefits, the consistency, the surety, and often it's hard to leave. And yet you can also, what I'm hearing is you can also do that in a creative scope. You took on this role and basically you checked out of everything else for 4 years.
Exactly. It's a really tricky one to balance, I think. Mm-hmm. And possibly something that I'm having to think about again now, but we'll come on to that, in a bit. But it's a fine balance. And I'm always fascinated to talk to anybody that actually has got it right.
But clarify the fine balance for everyone. What do you mean?
So, I think creativity for me, anyway, personally, is having that time and that space, is having that, where you can just sit and stare and you're not thinking, I've got to go and do that, answer that, do that. It is having time just to waft in the garden in the morning and actually have the time to notice something really beautiful that's happening in the flower bed, or be inspired. It's having time maybe to go on holiday, or go to the south of France and just be inspired by this incredible group of women that you meet. It's those are the things that fuel what I then want to create and want to carry on creating, because I don't want to get to, and maybe I've just got this very restless brain, but I never want to get to a point where I'm just doing the same thing over and over again. I'm always looking to do something else. So to explore, to carry on being curious, but it's time. So because there's only so many hours in the day, and then being a wife and a mother as well, and walking dogs and just having and seeing your mum and dad who are getting older and need a bit of attention from you, so it's just trying to work out what you can do to keep your business ticking on, because you need to make money. It has to be a productive thing that you're doing, but not killing that creativity that's fueling it as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's a fascinating concept that I think creatives have to work on even harder, is how to fuel that creativity, continue to fuel the creativity, and yet there's the whole right brain, whatever side of you that says, or left brain, whichever it is, I have no idea, that says, I have to make X. And also ego, when you take on a huge project, it makes you feel good. Yeah. Not realizing that project, it sounded like, as fabulous as it was and everything it taught you, it kind of sucked your creative energy out of you to some extent. Okay.
Yeah,
interesting.
Yeah. So at the end of the 4 years, I was like, kind of, well, where do I go from here? What do I do now? Do I even like gardens anymore? Do I... do I go back to the bank? No, obviously I was joking, but what do I do? I felt really, really quite lost and quite sad for a while. And then sometimes things are just in front of you and you can't see them, can you, just for looking, but my sister, who's a couple of years younger than me and has been with her partner for, 15 years, and they have a small boy, and decided finally she was going to get married. And she said this would have been 5 years ago this summer. Okay. And it was going to be a small affair. So we all got jobs. We were all given jobs around the family dinner table one night. And my husband got given the gift of making the cakes, which was hilarious because he doesn't bake. But so it's that kind of wedding. You can get the gist. And she said, and Lucy, you can do the flowers. And I was like, I quite fancy the idea of that, and I thought maybe that is it, that I've stopped looking at flowers. I've stopped looking at the thing that I was passionate about 20 odd years ago, 15 it would have been then, that took me into the landscape design in the first place. It's like, stop looking at your paints, isn't it? Or stop looking at the very thing but me being me, couldn't just then think, I'll just go and pick some flowers. I then had to turn that into the new bit. So I then decided I was going to become the next big wedding florist, and that was it. So I sort of go off down this kind of, thing. And I went off and thought, well, I need to learn how to become a professional florist, obviously, because I can't just wing it. So I sort of went on a couple of courses, and they just weren't for me at all. They just they weren't telling me how I saw flowers. So how I see flowers effectively is outside. It's how nature wants them to grow. And at that point, floristry was very much controlled, really sort of domes of flowers and all stuck in horrible thing like floral foam and all this hideous stuff, and and it wasn't actually about the flowers. Half of the people didn't even know what the flowers
were.
They were, yeah. And I just couldn't understand that at all. And I thought, oh, okay. And then I discovered Instagram, which at the time was still amazing. I know, love it, hate it. But I mean, it has changed my life actually, so I can't hate it that much. And I sort of went onto Instagram, and suddenly there were all these, and most of them actually were American florists at the time, who were doing the kind of thing I was like, yes, this is it. They were literally bringing the outside in. They were really bringing nature home. They were really going out into the garden, into the landscape, and then dragging that back in and creating these amazing things in water, really kind of, and I was like, oh yeah, this is what I want to do. So, so I stalked quite a lot of those people for a while and went on more workshops here in the UK with florists that had that aesthetic, and did my sister's flowers, and I loved it. But I soon decided I did not want to be a wedding florist at all, because that's really hard work. Hats off to anyone that can do that. Yes. I could have possibly done that when I was 25, but not reaching 50. So I decided I didn't want to do that. But I really I needed to keep those flowers in my life. I probably needed to go back to the landscape design, because actually that was where I was making money. That's what was helping to pay the mortgage. But by looking at those flowers and where those flowers would then take me was giving me this creative outlook that I'd been missing, that I had been craving, but wasn't sure what. So, and that would have been 4.5 years ago. So, and since then they've become an enormous part of my life. And I think they've actually helped make me a better garden designer. And I think garden design has made me a better, whatever you want to call me, floral stylist, florist, I don't know, floral person. And then it went on a bit more, because we were, obviously the world shut down. And all weddings were cancelled anyway. So a few that I had, they sort of were. But then I discovered, I was asked by a really lovely friend of mine, a Mexican florist, who is a proper florist, called Gabriela Salazar, La Musa de las Flores, whose work is exquisite. And we had become friends, and she asked me to go and help run a workshop in San Francisco. So off I went.
A workshop on?
Flowers. So on floral design, but rather than me sort of necessarily demonstrating a bowl, I was going more as a storyteller. Because by that stage, my Instagram had become quite heavily sort of biased towards, I was creating these stories without instinctively knowing I was doing that. So I had sort of, within lockdown, I had rediscovered my paints again, because finally I actually had sort of 8 weeks where the Prime Minister told me to stay at home and he would pay me to stay at home. And I had no emails to answer. So I was allowed, my chimp on my shoulder, whatever side of the brain was happy for me to do whatever I wanted to do. So I got all the sample paints out of the cupboard, all those little pots you have, and set up painting a wall. And I had a really, really lovely time. I know COVID was hideous for so many people, but I actually had a really nice time for about 6 weeks, just painting. And thought, oh gosh, I'd completely turned my back on art, but maybe I could bring it back into my life again somehow. So I did that. And then I started creating backdrops. and then the flowers would go in front of the backdrops, and I was trying to then create like a vignette, a story within that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's probably the answer to your question that you asked quite a long time ago.
No. But for those of you who are on YouTube, you can see this, and those of you who are listening to the podcast, jump over to the YouTube channel, because in the very back of Lucy, you see one of those backdrops, right? That you created, that you painted, to get an idea of what the beauty of these backdrops that you create. It's really quite, that you could just paint that in a room for me, wall to wall.
I have been asked a few times.
I bet you have. It's absolutely gorgeous.
The whole time thing,
Yeah. But talk about that story, because I think that's what I found so intriguing about you at this workshop. And I think we can all bring it. I should go backwards and just explain. In this workshop, we actually had to do arrangements at one session. I have never, ever done a flower arrangement in my life, other than sticking the tulips in the water. I didn't know there was a thing called a frog. I had no idea what it was, or that people use chicken wire. But when you talked about the story, and what is the story that you want to create, and this is relevant whether you're creating centerpieces to a party or something gorgeous for your mantle or the table behind, as an example. What is the story? Is that your starting point?
I think it always is for me. That's how I think about things. I guess I am a storyteller, really. Yes, that's how I always start. And that's what I was trying to say at the workshop, was that, I was stood next to lovely Sandra, who is this florist with this amazing, French shop in Andover. And she creates beautiful vases that are 360 degrees, beautiful all the way around, that would sit on a table that anybody would be very happy to look at over the table. Or on a hall pedestal, or a porch or whatever, or give as a bouquet to somebody. But that's not how I'm approaching it. My flowers I'm using for a totally different purpose. Yes, I'll give a bunch to my mother or a friend or whatever, and I will design gardens for my clients constantly. But the flowers that I particularly cut, they're only one-sided, because flowers are expensive. So my urns are effectively, it's all about smoke and mirrors. So, you can't see the back of the urn because it's going to be in front of a backdrop.
Okay.
So why fill it full of flowers when they're expensive? And I'd rather they stayed in the garden, quite frankly. And I'm and then when I'm doing my flowers, I'm thinking about how it will look to the viewer from a front-on point of view. So I'm thinking about how I'm going to frame it, like you might with a theatre set, so I'm going to frame it with maybe a curtain, or is it going to have a mirror? I'm thinking about it, I guess, from an artistic composition, how you might approach a painting as well, I guess. Sure. And that's not being deliberate. That's just kind of sort of instinctive, and how it's evolved really over the last few years.
Yeah.
And that's so I guess my role when I teach workshops, whether it's in San Francisco, whether it's in France or wherever, is that I'm coming from the thing of, what is the story that you're trying to tell? Like you said, are you are you doing flowers for a wedding? But if you are doing flowers for a wedding, then you're going to want to sell those flowers. You're going to want to build that business. So how do you get across what your style and your aesthetic is to your potential audience? And that's really important with how we portray, what we're doing. Like, do you want your flowers to speak of romance and softness, or do you want to have a harder, more industrial edge to your flowers? What's your brand? What is it you're trying to say? So I guess that's kind of that's kind of what my niche is now, what I've kind of fallen into now.
It's beautiful though, because I think it relates, even if one is not creating a brand, But what are brands is really a philosophical question, because even if you have a dinner party, you're branding the dinner party to a certain extent. Whether you're having a children's party, it's an entirely different brand than, an intimate gathering of your 6 closest friends for Valentine's Day. It's a very different brand for the evening. So really that story concept, and also it's beyond, it just fascinates me, but it's beyond the flowers, because now that was something I thought was so interesting. And to see the mural that you've painted behind you, or the backdrop, the flower is part of the environment. It's not in isolation. It's not this one thing, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think maybe as well that comes from designing gardens, because I'm always thinking about how the elements are all, so it's like anchoring your house within the landscape, isn't it? I always feel so sad when I see these new build houses and they're basically sat in a sea of gravel. That's their frontage, and you've got the brick comes or the render comes all the way down to this gravel, and the cars are parked as close to the front door as possible, and I always think that's really sad. I think, I like to have some softness around, so that she's got her shoe on. The house has her shoe on. She's anchored. So I guess always, or trees in the garden, giving you some height and everything. So I guess I don't give it a huge amount of thought. As I say, it's kind of just
instinctive.
20 years that have sort of, just looking. So
yeah. But also with your arrangements, you tend to bring just what you said, the outside in. You would go foraging, if that's the word, in the morning, and you'd bring in whatever you were finding outside, and that would be partially incorporated into the displays you were creating, right? Do you do that all the time? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, at home, I either use my garden, which isn't enormous, but I've got a small cutting garden. I've got the main garden, which I don't really tend to touch because I like it to look like a garden rather than sort of flowers, because I've taken them all inside. But I've got a small cutting area. And I also have a friend who lives about an hour from me who has a flower farm. And she grows specifically for florists on about an acre. And she'll grow, but it's all seasonal. So that's the other thing, is that I will only use what is season at that point.
Interesting. Okay.
And I will tend to use flowers that would actually naturally grow together outside. Okay. So I personally would struggle to, use tropical blooms with something that's very English, because I just find that a bit, in my head, it wouldn't live outside happily. So I don't think it lives happily in a vase, though other people do it very, very successfully. But that's their style. But so my work tends to be very English, obviously. I tend to use the flowers that happily will grow here. And at the workshop, we bought flowers from Paris, and we brought them up to the Luberon where we were staying. And there were a few blooms in there that I'm not used to using at all. So there were some really beautiful gardens within the hotel grounds. And we went to ask, always very respectful of gardens. So we went to ask the gardener whether we could, there was some incredible lilac that had just sort of grown really wild, and was just doing its really beautiful thing at that point. So we went and asked the gardener if he wouldn't mind, maybe if we could just take a few little sprigs of lilac that morning. And he was like, no, absolutely, that's absolutely fine. So Sandra and I crept out with our secateurs, and we, and it just kind of changed the feeling of the bowls, I think, having a few bits like that, because otherwise you tend to find if your flowers are bought from shops rather than grown in the garden, they tend to be like our carrots, very straight, very perfect, because that's how they've been grown in hot houses, to be perfect. Whereas I like in fact, I've got one here. I have my ranunculus. I like my ranunculus to have that quirky, sort of quirky little stem. So they look as if they've kind of been outside in the garden, fighting for light, fighting for their space.
Yeah. It's fun. There's an organic aspect to it that you don't get when everything, what did you call it? Carrot straight?
Well, it is, isn't it? Those perfect carrots. I'd much rather have a perfect carrot, But I think as a society, though, I think we're changing. I think, sort of that kind of, we're sort of still especially in some parts of the country, and I imagine it's the same in the States, but there are some places that still want everything very controlled, everything very 90s perfect, everything sort of, without any flaws at all. And then there's other people that are actually a bit more sort of in tune to nature and happy to have those imperfections that make it all so beautiful. So
yeah,
I think that kind of the slow food movement is moving into the slow flowers.
Flower. That's really interesting. Slow living, slow flowers. Yeah, yeah. So besides the different climates, say of England versus we were in the south of France, and you've been all over Europe and Normandy, not very soon actually, which is very different climate from the south of France. What is there a difference in how gardens are designed, laid out, even kind of the way, I don't know if this is too obscure, but the way people view flowers and flower arrangements, kind of different parts of US compared to, you were just in the United States?
I think that's a really interesting question, actually, and something that I'm sort of quite interested in pursuing a bit more at the minute. So I've always been quite blinkered because my design work has always been very much here in the northwest of the UK, which is invariably cold and damp. It rains a lot in Manchester. But since COVID and things have sort of exploded again from a design point of view, because everybody sat for 2 years looking at their gardens thinking we need a better space. So it went a bit mad. I've got a lovely, really lovely couple in Seattle that I've designed a garden for. Designed it over COVID, and I went to see them just as the US opened up again, which was last spring. Went and spent a week with them, and then came back and designed it at home. And we had lots and lots of Zoom over, and then I went back again when I was over in March, just gone. And that's been really fascinating because I was sort of thinking, well, I'm sure, why do you need me? I'm a long way away. Why would you want me here to come and design a garden for you? Surely that you've got designers over there. And she said, no, we want a European garden, and they don't get it here. It's because a very different style to European gardens than there is to American gardens. Now, this is in Seattle, so I'm sure this, you're such a huge country over there. Always blows my mind.
I think there's some consistency. It's part of the culture,
Right.
What do you think the difference was? What were you bringing that they couldn't get? Yeah.
Well, the most obvious. So they've got this huge farm which is set just below Mount Rainier in Seattle. So they've got an incredible view of this mountain, of this volcano, but it's very, very flat. And it's all. I mean, it's suffered from logging. Histories of logging over the years. But they were looking to turn it into a wedding venue. So it needed to have vistas and focal points and places to sit and places to gather and places to eat and everything. And I thought, okay, well, that's fine. That's fairly standard across things. But they've got these neighbouring farms that aren't particularly attractive that we really needed to screen. And we needed to give, so if a bride's walking down this incredible pergola under a curtain of wisteria, having her moment, and then the end focal point is this really hideous farm at the end, that's not great, really. So, we needed to screen that. Now, here in Europe, I've never thought about it because it's so part of our culture. It's just something that we have. I'd never even questioned whether it was available in other parts of the world, especially the States, which has everything. Anything in the States you can have, bigger and better.
Bigger, maybe. I don't know about better. That's why they hired you.
Bigger. So I specified some instant hedging and some pleach trees. Now, so anybody who doesn't know what pleach trees are, effectively they are hedges on stilts. So I don't know if you can visualize them. So effectively you would have something like a beech hedge, which would have a head of about 8 foot. So an 8 foot high, and it would be on a 10-foot trunk.
Okay.
Like a box, effectively.
Fascinating.
On a 10-foot but that can alter,
Right.
trunk. And then you plant them together, and effectively you end up with all of these trunks, and then this hedge, this screen. And it's a very it's a very European feel. It's quite controlled, but it's also gives you that kind of structure and formality to a garden, which then allows you to plant it out with a very kind of wild-esque planting perennial style, because you've got this structure that holds the whole thing together.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then some instant hedging. So anybody that's been to, for example, the Chelsea Flower Show or any of, they create these instant gardens by bringing in these cubes of hedge, which may be, say, Taxus yew hedge, and they can be anything from 1.5 meters to 3 meters tall, and they come in cubes, and effectively you stack them all together, and you've got this instant hedge that looks like it's been there for the last 50 years. Oh. And I thought, perfect. We'll bring this in. It's not particularly cheap because yew is really slow growing, but we'll bring this in. They were fine with that. Just need it to be sorted. You can't get it. You can't get it there. You can't. We did find some hedging eventually, not Chelsea standard, but we did find something okay. Pleached hedges,
Forget it.
No, absolutely not. And I was like, surely, I don't understand. And I spoke to my nursery guys here, who pretty much work all over the world. And I said, look, can we get some trees? So these trees for us, they're basically mainly grown in Europe because they have the space to grow these trees. And we just bring them across. It's much more tricky now, obviously, since Brexit.
Yes.
But we still just bring them across. It's not far to bring them across. No, can't get them over there. Just can't. They're just not something that you have. And that kind of blew my mind a bit, really.
Yes.
So there is very, very, very definitely a European style of design that I was really surprised about. But there you go. So, and then
that's fascinating. No, it's fascinating because everything is cultural to some extent, and Americans are used to open spaces. They created the open kitchen as an example, and they like open spaces, and therefore hedging, at a higher level with the tree trunks is something like, why would you do that? And yet, as we become more and more populated, obviously in different areas, that may make sense. But it's fascinating.
That's really interesting point. Actually, that totally makes sense because you do have so much space over there, whereas we are so crowded here. We have. So I think maybe that's absolutely where, and even in France, they've got far more space than we have in the UK. We're so tiny, but not as much as you've got in the States.
Yeah.
And maybe that is, and Italy and places like that. So maybe that is why we very much compartmentalized and sort of made this our space. This is our. Yeah. But I think we quite like having that feeling of enclosure, that sort of feeling of intimacy that sometimes you just don't get from, we've got loads and loads of an enormous space around us, isn't it? It's fabulous, but you don't get that kind of intimacy that you might get from sat in your snug at home, that kind of.
No. Well, and I think it's fascinating, the difference even in public garden designs, in United States. And so many of them are big, huge open spaces where you can see from one end to the other, where it doesn't matter what garden you're in Europe, you don't see on the other side. You cannot see through. So it's an interesting cultural difference. But I hear so many Americans talk about, because not all Americans have great big huge yards, how do I create privacy in my garden? How do I create boundaries so that I feel as though I can go out and have a glass of wine or whatever in the backyard, and I don't have to wave to all my neighbors. A lot of us live in those kinds of places. So,
well, there you go. There's a definitely, if somebody wants to start.
Exactly. But
I'll be first on the list.
When did you write the first book? And now I hear there's a second book, correct? So talk about your books, because you haven't even mentioned this.
Got that bit. Well, that was the other thing I did in COVID. So we were locked down for quite a long time here in Wales. We have our Welsh minister really didn't want us to go out at all anywhere. So we were locked down for far longer than anybody else. So I had quite a lot of time on my hands. And it's always been something. So with my Instagram, I started to, for the captions on Instagram, this was years ago, I just started sort of wittering really. Sort of and talking about my family and having a teenage son and all those things that come with having a teenage son and 2 young puppy dogs and a vaguely grumpy husband, so I think it just kind of sort of people kind of related to that because that's just life, isn't it, really?
It is.
And so I was having this sort of smoke and mirrors picture of all these flowers looking perfect, well, not imperfectly imperfect. And then just sort of write about actually what a crazy week it has all been and everything. And I don't know, people just seem to like it. So it's always sort of been muted that maybe I should write something, but never had time. And then it came along and I had a friend who introduced, she'd written quite a few books, and she introduced me to her publisher, who's a Ryland Peter Small, who are a small publishing house, but they've got an office here in London and one in New York as well. So they had a foot in both camps. Okay. And they sort of do coffee table books. Anyway, they decided this would be great and they'd like that. And so I sort of set about writing about bringing the outside in, basically, and really enjoyed it. Really, really loved that. And then while that was still fresh and it was all exciting, they asked if I'd like to write another one. And I sort of said, yes, that'd be great. But then I didn't realize how busy I was going to become.
Post-COVID, when your life started back up.
Yeah. When life started again, actually, back to reality. Yeah. So I'm in editing. I won't call it hell at the minute, but I'm in editing flux. I've got the deadline is literally next week or something. It has to go into production. So yeah, I'm sort of busy writing captions and yeah.
So what's the next book about?
So the next book is, the title is A Floral Love Story Inspired by the Landscape. So it's more about being out. I wanted to go to the various parts of the landscape. So we've got the countryside and the meadows. We've got the mountains and the forests, the coast, and then the cities and villages. And what it is within each of those different landscapes that I take as inspiration and bring back to the studio, and how that inspires my work as a florist, floral stylist, whatever you want to call me.
Sure.
So it's really nice actually, because I wanted to do it because the last one, I was stuck in COVID, I couldn't go anywhere at all. So the book felt very English. And so much of my time, I do spend a lot of time in the US now, which I love. I love being over there, and some time in Europe as well. So I wanted it to have a more of a slightly different feel. Okay. So the cities is very much based in New York, which was lovely, and the coast is in Greece. A little bit from France a few couple of weeks ago. And the mountains is here in North Wales. Lake districts, but yeah, so it's been I really enjoy doing it, but it's really
I think like anything, it's sort of like having children to some extent. It's awful and it's fantastic.
Exactly.
To some extent, the end result is pretty darn fabulous, but the process is not so easy sometimes.
It's particularly painful.
The birth part and the raising. You had teenagers, you got through that phase, and that can be hard, really hard. So talk a little bit though about why we should embrace flowers. So, I live in 2 different condos, one in Paris and one in Boston. And so it's not like I have a back garden. I have a terrace, that I could be growing something, but something in my mind when doing that workshop with you, when we were here I was in my ignorance, putting flowers in. There's something happened though. There's something about it. So what is it about flowers that's actually good for our mental health, good for humankind, if you want to call it that?
Being outside, isn't it? It's just being
Yeah.
outside with nature, because she doesn't require you to be anything or anything.
Mm,
She's just quietly getting on and doing her thing, trying to ignore the interference that we're constantly interfering with and trying to sabotage and everything, but
yeah.
she's just doing her thing. And I think it's very familiar. And I think it's really reassuring, and life isn't particularly reassuring at the minute, is it? For so many people, and for, so many, anxiety and mental health and everything. And to me, I know that I'm a better, calmer, probably nicer to live with person if I'm allowed to spend time just outside, just barefoot or not, but just looking at flowers. I'm just looking at my vase of flowers. I've just got to be on this thing now, and I don't know. It's just unassuming. It's just easy.
Mm-hmm.
So I think everybody, you don't have to have a huge garden. You don't have to have enormous 27 acres of potato fields. You don't need that. And I think COVID actually showed that. The number of people that craving being outside and took so much solace from and wanted to. The seed companies all went. Didn't have enough seeds to send people because that's what they wanted to do. So, there is something that we go back to basics, I think, really. And I think it makes you slow down as well. I'm pretty impatient. I'm quite a restless, impatient person. My parents were always really surprised when I said I wanted to be a gardener. And I wouldn't say I'm the best gardener in the world, but because of that patience, but it does force me to pot things up. It does force me to wait, it does force me to respect the seasons as well.
Yeah.
And I think it just, So,
So we're out of control in a way, in a comfortable way,
yes,
to a great extent. And yet we get surrounded and almost loved by being outside and being in nature, or just having a beautiful bouquet that you yourself put together sitting on your desk. It's Mother Nature created that flower in a way.
Absolutely. Yeah. And having that scent, having the scent from, I think I talked about this in the workshop, we were talking about flowers and how over the years, the flowers that come from Europe, which is where the majority of flowers of the world are sent from, from Amsterdam, from Holland, they've been bred to get rid of their scent, because scent is what actually is the flower sending out those signals to be pollinated and, and everything. But the scent is what's making the flower decay. It's killing the flower effectively. So they've bred that out. So now you've got this scentless, totally carrot straight rose that's, to my mind, utterly joyless, because the joy is in that scent. And I would rather have, an hour of fleeting, oh my goodness, gorgeousness, rather than 3 weeks of this stiff, really uninspiring rose, but I think that's possibly educating people to possibly just gently, rather than wanting our flowers to last a lifetime, is maybe just enjoying those moments.
That in the moment it is pretty fantastic. It doesn't have to be something that lasts forever. That's a hard lesson for Americans, because we're used to things that last, whether it's food or cars, or we think things should last forever.
I think they all do. I think that society has sort of
interesting.
Capitalism has bred that into us, hasn't it? And it's all about what stuff's worth and how much, what value. The number of people that with their flowers, they feel that the value is in how many stems they've got, rather than so it's like, I want more, I want more, I want more, I want more value for money, and rather, and it's how do we get away from that? I don't know. Is it something? Hopefully we can, but
Well, and how do we define value? That's what you're really getting to is how do we switch the way we define value or the way we define joy or the way we define, a fantastic life or an accomplished life? How all of that is, maybe that was the gift of COVID, is it allowed us to look at life entirely different, whether it was our gardens, our homes, our kids, our cooking, whatever it was.
Just really value those really simple things. It was absolutely right, a gift. But what worries me is how quickly we go back.
Yeah.
How quickly we forget and just slip back into those ways, and I noticed it in myself, I noticed that, I was happy. I don't like online shopping particularly, especially for things like clothes and things, so I was happy with my sample pots. I was happy with actually not having much. I was happy with having just a few tomatoes from the garden rather than thinking I needed everything that the supermarket could give me. I was just content. And I notice now I'm sort of, more, I need more. And I don't need more, but it's just going back into that familiar pattern that I've grown up with, I guess.
Right. Yeah. That's a very good point. The familiar draws us no matter what, whether it's positive or negative. It's comfortable because it's something that makes sense to us. So in closing, Lucy, talk about what's exciting you right now. What's like piquing your curiosity. I know you've got some irons in the fire and I don't want you to, reveal all of them, but share a little bit if there's bits and pieces of what is out there right now that's piquing your curiosity, that's causing you to say, I want to know more about that or explore that.
Well, I'm really loving actually the opportunity that I'm getting to travel a lot more.
Okay.
So, I'm traveling to the States, but to different places in the States, not like just going to the States, because it takes as long to fly from Heathrow to JFK as it does from JFK to San Francisco, which always blows my mind.
Yes, it does.
But I'm really enjoying that and meeting all these, really lovely people from such different parts of life and being inspired by them. And then, France and Italy, and I'd like to get over to Asia at some point, maybe. So that would be wonderful, and sort of embrace what's growing over there and
fascinating.
Maybe looking at the native bloom, maybe looking at tropical blooms, but going to the places where they just grow naturally without any effort. So that's something that I'd like to pursue while I'm still have the energy to do it. I'm determined, though I say this, but to carry on with my painting. I did really love that, and I've started to experiment with making paints with natural pigments, so from flowers and minerals and things. Not saying I'm the best at it. I'm not saying I think it's such a huge thing, and some people write entire books about just doing that. But I'm fascinated by the colours and just giving myself time and possibly where that would lead. So I'd like to do some more painting, I think. And then maybe I always said that the landscapes would become smaller, but actually they're getting bigger at the minute. So, we'll see where that takes me. But I guess trying to remember what I preach, which is just be mindful about what I take on. So I can really, and choose, but it's very difficult when you're offered, wonderful opportunities to turn them down, isn't it, really? So
that are like treats, and it gets back to that question of wanting more, and do I really need more, and does this experience really give me joy? Will it give me joy? Very interesting. So I have to connect you with a woman. I think she's up in Vermont, and she has a farm called a Wing and a Prayer. And she uses flowers to dye the wool of her sheep.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting how, obviously she's not a painter, but she's dyeing wool that
Yeah.
people are making into sweaters and whatnot. Again, it's almost a return to simpler living, slower living, but yet cleaner living. We're impacting the environment so much less by using what's here, you know.
Yeah. No,
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
fascinating. Well, thank you, Lucy. This was fantastic. You and I could talk forever, as I said. So thank you so much for joining us today. Did I miss anything? Is there any last words of wisdom you want to share that I forgot to ask?
No, I don't think so. Thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for being with us today.